kind of organizational what?
Intentionality, thank you. Don't ever do that again.
Really?
Because, hell, who knows? It's just pouring past.
So it was most intense
Well, it went on for a long, long time. It went on for months. It went on for years. And in a way, it still goes on. I mean, like last night, it's a certain quality of certitude, a certain tone that comes into my inner musings, and I know it's not me and what is suggested is going to work. I know in advance that it's going to work, and it said, go get graph paper. What are the ordering principles of the King Wen sequence? And I thought, this is a strange kind of revelation. And then it just marched me toward these conclusions. And the interesting thing is it's still marching me toward, there is more to come. I don't live in the aura of this thing like I used to. I mean, for the first 5 years or so, I had to be very careful what I said to people, because it concerned them. And, for the first 14 days after he did it, I didn't sleep at all. And I had no fatigue. I had nothing. And I even had an explanation. I have become superconductive. I will never eat again. I will never sleep again. I have sealed myself off from the world of, and then slowly I had to deal with the fact that this apparently wasn't true. But for a long, long time, it was ambiguous because I couldn't believe that I didn't sleep. It was an amazing experience. The day would go on. We would gather wood, wash dishes, do what had to be done. And then around 10 o'clock at night, everybody would go to bed. And I would just be left there. And then I would go walking in the pastures around La Chorrera. And I would look up into the sky, and it would connect the zodiacal signs together for me. And I could see the world machinery moving, and I could see down in... I said, this is really something. I mean, this is pure understanding. It just is going on hour by hour. Well, the way to squeeze it down is apparently into this thing. This is what it is. And if you've heard me talk before, what time is it anyway? Are we running over?
4:52.
What time? Oh, 10 to 5. One of the things that I've talked about in other lectures, this is the first time I've ever constructed all this together at one time and explained to an audience why I have this particular list of obsessions. But one of the things that I talk about is flying saucers and the relationship of flying saucers to the alchemical goal. Well, my notion is that in a way that I hope I am not the only person in the cosmos that can perceive, this thing is a flying saucer. In other words, remember an hour or so ago, a few minutes ago, I called it an analogical engine and said an analogical engine would be used to power a vehicle that moves through the hyperspace of imagination. I think that what lies at the end of history is the concrescence of this thing into itself, that this wave here on the wall, here in the computer, is one phase in the condensation of something which wants to be much more than this. Perhaps all it could be 2,000 years ago was the King Wen sequence and the technology for using it. Now it can be this, but it is growing denser. It's growing more real. It is impinging more and more on the world of cause and effect. And I think what's happening is some kind of breakthrough about the understanding of time that will ultimately create a trans-dimensional vehicle. I don't know if a trans-dimensional vehicle is a time machine per se, but I've had a lot of trouble, or one of the things that's occupied a lot of my thinking is trying to imagine what is at the end of the graph when all of these billions of years and all the organic novelty and all the novelty of culture and all the novelty of the 20th century and all this stuff is squeezed and compacted and interleaved and pushed down and down into this alchemical object, well then what is it exactly? And one of the notions that was very strong in the output of the Logos was that this is a tool-making process, that what we are involved in is the creation of some kind of a tool, the ultimate tool. This is what the Philosopher's Stone is. This is what the flying saucer is. And it said, imagine you have these two opposites. Here is mind, here is matter. Imagine, and this is what the alchemists did, imagine the migration of these two terms, these two antithetical terms, toward each other, and a mingling of them without a loss of the ontological integrity of either state. In other words, a piece of mind which is matter, a piece of matter which is mind. This is hyperdimensional translinguistic matter. What is it? Well, it's matter, but it behaves like thought. You can eat it, and it will sustain you. You can desire that it stretch out above you and shoot water at you and take a shower underneath it. You can stretch it out still further and sit on it, and it will move you from place to place. You can ask it questions, and it will give you answers. You can look into it and see different places and different times. It is a matrix, a monadic matrix of space-time fractality that is somehow accessible to you as a tool. Now, this notion of tools introduces the thought of Marshall McLuhan, who said, we are the extensions of our media. Our categories and the ratios of our senses are shaped by the forms of media with which we surround ourselves. It also introduces themes that were elaborated by the French sociologist Jacques Ellul. Ellul said, was his great dictum, there are no political solutions, only technological ones. The rest is propaganda. And then he spent a book explaining what he meant by political solutions, technological solutions, and propaganda. And I think to a degree this is true. There are no political solutions, only technological ones defined in the broadest sense, and the rest is propaganda. So what, if we then look at this as the orange chart as the history of a tool-making process, well then what is this tool and where are we in relationship to it? Well, I think that this hallucinogen-saturated, hyperdimensionally transformed, superconducting genetic material is the stuff of which the Philosopher's Stone is to be composed. It is a kind of projective matrix for the organic holograms of mind. It exists in an ontological twilight zone between ordinary matter and ordinary thought. At one point I produced the metaphor that what culture is trying to do in the 20th century is turn itself inside out, exteriorize the mind, interiorize the body. So the body is an object freely commanded in the world space called imagination, you see, and that this somehow, this alchemical possibility, the lapis philosophorum, glimpsed most clearly by the alchemical speculators of the 16th century. This is an anticipation of a new state of being, and perhaps what is anticipating it is the solid state matrices which support our cybernetic cultural coral reef, that this stuff I'm talking about, which is both mind and matter, is in fact very densely ramified silicon of some sort, or it is synthetic DNA. You know, there is talk of building computers that will run on DNA-like polymers. Well, clearly what's happening here is this wish to mirror ourselves is reaching levels where we may not only mirror ourselves, we may surpass our expectations. I've tried to imagine the appearance of an invention which would fundamentally alter things so totally that the world would never be the same again. And for a long time I didn't try to do this. I felt that asking the question, what lies beyond the end of the graph, was sort of not playing the game. The game is the graph. What bad taste to ask what lies after the graph. But recently I've had a series of thoughts about it, and I'll share them with you. They're not formed, and there may be internal contradiction. I find it hard to think about this kind of thing. But here's a technological scenario that would fulfill the wave and properly end the world in AD 2012. I'm grateful to Nick Herbert for the ideas which put me onto this. He'll have a book out sometime next year called Faster Than Light, and I read it in order to give a critical comment, and I thought it was brilliant. One of the things he talks about in there is the feasibility of time travel and various time travel schemes. And he suggested something which I had never really thought about before, which is, what if we are living in the following kind of universe? A universe in which it is theoretically possible to travel forward in time, but a universe in which it's theoretically possible to travel forward in time, and it's possible to travel backward in time, but no further than the moment of the invention of the first time machine. Do you see? Now, someone might say, well, why couldn't you travel further back in time than the moment of the invention of the first time machine? Well, the answer is obvious. You can't travel further back in time than that, because before that time there were no time machines. Do you see? So this had never occurred to me, and in the science fiction I've read, I've never heard it worked out that way. So then I tried to imagine, well, what if the discovery of this kind of time travel lies not very far in the future? What would it be like? And so I tried to imagine the moment of the invention of the first time machine of this sort. And I will lead you through, since we're at Esalen, let's call this a visualization. And it goes like this. It's a few minutes before dawn of 2012 AD at the World Temporal Studies Institute at La Chorrera in New Amazonas. And technicians are putting the finishing touches on the temporal probe, which is going to be sent off into the future for the first time. And the Lady Temponaut has been strapped into the machine, and the countdown is in progress. As the first rays of the sun rise over the Amazon jungle in the east, the button is pushed, and this great exploring pioneer sails off into the future. Now, ordinary considerations would have us follow this gallant explorer into whatever adventures await her in the misty realms of the future. But being perverse, I will ask a different question, which is, what do we see at the Temporal Studies Institute a moment after the Temponaut disappears off into the future? And remember, this is a universe in which you can travel backward in time once the first time machine is invented, but you can't travel any further back in time. So it seemed to me what would happen is, at that very moment, time machines from many points in the future would appear suddenly at the site of the Temporal Studies Institute, eager to witness the historical event of the turning on of the first time machine, and eager to test these later versions of it by sailing as close to the temporal barrier as possible. So suddenly the whole world would be invaded with people from all points in the future coming to witness this event. Are you with me so far?
Just like Alice through the looking glass, perhaps?
Well, at least.
More so.
So, this seemed really interesting to me, and I had to restrain myself from calling Hollywood. But then I got to thinking about it, and I thought, there's something wrong with this scenario. And it slowly came to me what it was. And this is where I sense the possibility that I'm speaking nonsense. And so please pay careful attention. The objection which is always put to time travel schemes of all sorts is called the murder your grandfather paradox. And it works like this. Time machines are not possible because if they were, you could go back in time and murder your grandfather. And if you murder your grandfather, you do not exist. Therefore, you cannot go back in time and murder your grandfather. Therefore, time machines cannot exist. And it's been very hard to overcome this paradox. Well, now, in the scenario that I just sketched, where after December 22nd, 2012 AD, this new kind of domain opens up where people not only have to decide where they're going to live, they have to decide when they're going to live. And some people say, we love the 27th century. The lunar arcologies are so amusing. We spend every summer there. And other people say, well, we prefer the quaint primitiveness of the immediate post-breakthrough world. And so we live in 2020, just a few years after the breakthrough on our ranch in Argentina. And this sort of thing. Get the idea that there's this much larger temporal domain, and people have addresses in time as well as space.
Fun. All right.
I like it.
But there is a problem.
Can you change your mind a few times?
Oh, sure. You could move around. You say, we're living in the fifth, or the, whatever, moving around. But there is a problem, and that is hypothetical citizen A living in the 25th century after time travel could theoretically go back in time toward the beginning, but stop in the era of his great-grandfather and do the old boy in. And suddenly we've got the kill your own grandfather paradox on our hands again, and it looks like we haven't made any progress at all. And so I thought, that really seems to do it for that. And then I realized, and try and help me, there's a value dark dimension in this for my imagination apparatus, but see if you can help me out. Here is what I think would really happen on that morning in 2012 when the Lady Temponaut is sent off into the future. The moment that the first time machine begins to operate, time machines do not begin arriving from all points in the future. Instead, what happens is the most advanced future state of the human family possible arrives immediately. The entirety of the rest of all of the future occurs in a microsecond. Now, why is this? It's because, let's make a three-dimensional model and see if we can understand how this might work. As you know, on this planet today, we have both extremely highly technical industrial civilizations possessing computers and so forth and so on, and we have extremely primitive hunter-gatherer groups relying on shamanism and natural magic. Like Esalen. And what do we see happening in the interaction between the high-tech industrial cultures and the hunter-gatherers? What is happening? The hunter-gatherers are being completely absorbed into the high-tech culture. The localized values are being traded in for global values. Everybody wants to be as hot as New York, Las Vegas, Paris, and Hong Kong. It's that sort of thing. Well, I think a similar thing would happen in this temporal domain that I'm talking about, and that the most advanced states of human accomplishment that could still be called human accomplishments lie just a millisecond on the other side of the barrier to the transformation of information forward into the future, because this hyperdimensional temporal domain is filled by energy states the way a chamber is filled by a gas. And if you know the mechanics of gases, if you inject a gas into a vacuum-filled sphere, the gas immediately distributes itself so that there is an even distribution throughout. Well, I think in this post-time travel temporal domain, information from the far future would evenly distribute itself through the entire domain, so that hyperspace really means the emergence into eternity. And the technological barrier to this is thinner than we might suppose. If we could transmit information or a person into the future, we could collapse the state vectors of three-dimensional time and space and enter into this hyperdimensional equilibrium of information. And I think on one level that is what the transcendental object is. It is all space and all time, including vast amounts of future time, which have in some sense been compressed and normalized in a plenum. You see? So that we and this would be the forward escape. This would vindicate the scenario of hope, because what it means is, grim as our situation is, with atomic pollution and ozone fading and greenhouse and genetic wearing, all this stuff, if we could create that technological artifact instantly we would be able to call upon the resources of human ingenuity that were evolved billions of years in the future. In other words, machines the size of Manitoba could instantly appear above the planet, or whatever it is. In other words, the oversoul is a temporally, tremendously advanced form of ourselves, but the only way that it can reach into the dimension of history and halt the toxification of the planet is if we are able to, in effect, send a signal for help, send a cry,
Or break the glass.
or break the glass. That's what it is. So,
There's a problem with that.
yes, tell me the problem.
At the moment that this happens, the moment of breakthrough, when the first time machine is switched on, if at that moment time essentially comes to an end, then all of these further developments of the next however many centuries would not happen.
Well,
It's cut off at that point.
they don't come to an end. What happens is they happen very quickly. In other words, and this is a very weird quality about this theory that I haven't talked about yet, so it's good that we mention it. Remember how I said it takes 72 billion years to create a wavelength sufficient that we can embed the whole universe into it? And then you take the 72 billion and you divide it by 64 and you get the next cycle. It's something like 1.3 billion. Good agreement with the emergence of, I can never remember whether they're prokaryotes or eukaryotes. Prokaryotes, 1.3 billion years ago. Well, then you divide it again, and it's something like, I don't know, 165 million or something. And then you divide it again, and it's 18 million. And then you divide it again, and it's 275,000. And then you divide it again, and it's 4,306. And then you divide it again, and it's 384 days. Well, now at this point we've done 6 divisions. But to get to Planck's constant, we have to do about 10 more of these divisions. And these progressively shorter cycles, which we perceive as progressively shorter, below the 384-day cycle, there's a 6-day cycle, a hour-and-a-half cycle, a 6-minute cycle, and then they get smaller and smaller until they disappear into the subatomic dimension. But a weird thing about that kind of closure is that a process like that took 72 years to happen would be only halfway finished 3 hours before its end. In other words, do you see, because the collapse is so rapid, it's only halfway through when it's an hour and a half from being finished. So what I propose is that all the long ages of the future happen in the last 15 seconds preceding the concrescence, and that, I know this isn't easy to understand, but neither is the Trinity or something like that. The concrescence of time, the way in which all of the future can happen in a few seconds, and then we can reach the end of time. We don't go from the morning of 2012 and leap over all that future to get to the end of time. We just compress it into hours. And so imagine the novelty. Imagine, now here's a visualization. Imagine the novelty of the situation in the last hours before the concrescence. Because what it means is 384 days before December 22nd, 2012, there was a massive transition into the last scale. And in that 384 days, all of history is being reenacted. So fashions and styles and obsessions, here's ancient Egypt, it's replaced by Assyria, the next hit tune celebrates the Hittites, and it's just sailing past. Then 6 days before December 22nd, 2012, there is, if any of you ever read Robert Heinlein's story, The Year of the Jackpot, you can appreciate this scenario. 6 days before it reaches the end, some whole new set of modalities begin to ingress, and the whole scenario of human history is compressed into this 6-day thing. Notice that the book of Revelations contains a 7-day scenario where angels come down and hurl plagues on the earth, and then on the 3rd day the oceans burn, and then it's this kind of thing. It's exciting times. And then a few hours before dawn, or an hour and a half before dawn, you drop into another level of novelty. And then, in that last half hour, in that last hour and a half, most of it concentrated in the last 11 minutes, 13 such collapses of the wave are undergone as the mystery just is shedding veils. It's like that thing in Druidic mythology where the eyelids keep opening and the ray keeps getting stronger and illusions are being shed, understanding is building, everything is falling into place. But imagine how far, no wonder we can't understand the plan, because we are so many levels away from the revelation of the naked, the truly naked outlines of what this intentionality is. Now, I know that this sounds highly improbable, but remember that the competing orthodox idea would have you believe that the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant. On balance, I'd say that's pretty much a 50-50 proposition. Which seems to you more likely? That the super-complex universe we're living in could suddenly undergo a series of catastrophic epistemic collapses that would produce a hyperdimensional enfolding of itself? Or that in the plenum of pure vacuum, a cosmos for no reason could spring into being? It's interesting how extreme the assumptions of any point of view that seeks to explain reality
How is this
are.
related to samadhi or nirvana?
I think that all of these states, altered states, yogic states, hallucinogens, are doorways, anticipations of eternity, is what Wordsworth said, or intimations of eternity is what Wordsworth said. That this is what we mean by spirit. We mean the hyperdimensional informational surround that we can feel but not see, but which informs and gives meaning to what is going on.
Does it occur more? Oh, go ahead.
They, however, left, pretty accurate maps on how to get there. I mean, you need a teacher, and some people would have a harder time, but when you consider those forms of technology, more useful and perhaps less complicated than machine technology.
Well, I think that they have approximations to what we're talking about. That in a way, what we're talking about, and this is hard for me to understand, so it's fine if it's hard for you to understand. What we're trying to do is build a metaphor which at some point, without any of us noticing that it has happened, it crosses over and is no longer a metaphor but is a thing. And the yogic techniques, I think, and all these other techniques that I've talked about, lead you to contemplate it, but they don't drag it out. I mean, we really need to understand how it works. We need more data. We need more shamanism. We need to build linguistic bridges to the traditions that talk about this stuff, we've not really taken these shamans seriously. We haven't learned their control languages. We haven't learned what the terms they use mean. You know, magical objects, sensaks, mantras, mandalas. We think we know what they're talking about, but we really don't know. As we learn, I think we're going to realize that aligning ourselves with these totality symbols is the way personally to transcend the historical dilemma, and then persuading other people to try these forms of thinking is the way to try and create a collective transcendence.
There seem to be also forms of being. I mean, your lifestyle has to change drastically in order to enter these hyper-dimensional spaces, you know. And it's more a lifestyle as well as a way of thought.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think because the lifestyle that is being culturally pushed is a lifestyle of acquiescence in the pre-existing models. You know, I mean, you just go along to get along kind of thing, and the fact that they tell you that their model of history is that it's trendlessly fluctuating, and their model of human beings is the most advanced model they can offer us is the citizen. They don't give a lot of hope, you know, they don't give a lot of credit to human beings. I mean, I think we are caught up in some kind of incredible cosmic drama. All human history, this is something I wanted to say, I see human history as a psychedelic experience stretched out over 10,000 years. And when you take psilocybin, or when you take these things, you see the replay. I mean, you do see it. You see the greasy smoke from burning Jewish villages streaking the skies of Central Asia. You hear the thunder of hoofbeats. You sense, you know, the clash of steel, and it's weird. It's all there. And William Blake said, "Nothing is lost," he says. Over 6,000 years, not one atom has been lost. But where is it? It's in hyperspace.
I get the impression what these methods want and what they, you know, are intended for is just to turn us into better and better receptive devices. You know, we're like tuning forks, and it's all out there in the field, and what we have to do is just become better and better receptors, you know, and tune into all of these frequencies.
Well, in a sense, that's true. Isn't that what Taoism says? It's this notion of appropriate activity. Go with the flow, know what the flow is, and then go with it. It is this, see, I think ego is this fragmented state where we don't believe we're connected to each other or to the earth, so Ellen has to figure it out, Kathleen has to figure it out, I have to figure it out. It's each of us, our job to figure it out, and we're completely islanded from each other. And naturally, how can we expect me or Kathleen or Ellen, based on our limited experience, I mean, my God, we've only lived some few decades of years, to get straight with a universe billions of years old, to know how to be in it. But if we could contact this Tao, another way of talking about the Tao is to call it, and the I Ching sometimes does this, the Tao of the ancestors. What is the Tao of the ancestors? It's nothing mystical at all. It's the right way for you to do something. I pick up this pencil. There is a right way for me to do it. What way is that? It's the way that McKennas have always picked up pencils. That's the way that I should pick up a pencil that requires the least effort on my part. That is the minimal energy path for me to pick up a pencil. And this can be extended to all of life. What Tao is, when embodied, is appropriate activity, always. And the wonderful thing about the I Ching is it doesn't say, don't eat meat. It doesn't say, never slay your enemy. It says, always do the appropriate thing. and it's never set what it is. Conditions determine what is the appropriate thing. So it doesn't serve a moral agenda. It simply serves this notion of howness, of suchness, of being in the world in such a way that you are a transparent medium through which the world can work its will.
The only
Like
reason,
Machiavelli.
this bucket of bolts behind you, this computer and this tape recorder and all this McLuhan technology, I mean, the only purpose I can see it, as far as I can tell, is to transmit this ancient knowledge on a global scale.
Yeah, I agree.
That's it. I mean, for more consumption and more, that seems absolutely purposeless, to use this technology for those. A better chicken, a better, it's just...
No, it's for information transfer. It's always amazed me. I mean, I have this wave pretty well in me, and I know a person who is an astrologer, and you can say, I was born in May of 1925, and he'll say, well, let's see, in the middle of May of 1925, Mercury went retrograde, and Saturn was at the and what he is doing is he is seeing the solar system in 1925. It's a machine that he can run it around to any date you mention. I can move through the wave this way. Now, English is a thing like that we all can do.
So it's like climbing. This is like I looked at the cliffs today. I see the wave in the cliffs in the sense of that maybe this could be like a series of cliffs, and if you can remember as you're climbing, you could probably remember that again. It's like you could pull it out of your head. I'm trying to say you could go there, and you could be a guide in a sense.
That's right. And looking at the orange one, remember how I said this is a map of how everything happens. Now you should be able to see it with new eyes when I say, think of it as the discharge of a synapse. Think of it as a love affair. Think of it as the history of a dynasty. It is all of these things, and what many general systems theorists have done, and what David did last night with his diagram, is most general systems theorists, if you press them, will pull a diagram out of their pocket. That's their topological signature for process. What I did that went slightly further is I time-scaled mine so that we can always see it against calendrical time, because I took that very seriously. Yeah.
So this scenario would necessarily imply physical immortality for those who will be alive in 2012.
Or it could imply physical immortality for everybody beginning in 2012. We don't know what the limits of it are, what the relationship, where do dead people go? Do they have a part to play in this? What is the imagination is the real question here. I think imagination is the growing apperception of hyperspace, and living in the imagination, which is a very hard thing to imagine, is nevertheless what we are called upon to suppose, that we are going to actually live in the domain of our conceptuality. My mother used to say, probably yours did too, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. Well, I'm here to saddle that horse because I think it's possible, Let's take wishes, the wish for the Philosopher's Stone, for a transcendent option for humanity. Let's turn it into a horse, and we can ride out of this town, no sweat.
Last dimensional, three-dimensional last hurrah. Okay, this basically.
Yes,
before jumping into.
That's what it is. The 20th century is the finale of history. The great Wagnerian chords are being sounded, and then silence will fall. People will tug on their furs and overcoats and leave the theater and wander out into eternity. And on that note...
I wanted to respond to what Michael said about meditation, and I'm wondering if in advanced states of meditation that what you said about the plant chemistry bonding to the DNA if we don't do that with our own neurochemical juices.
I think that's highly possible. The DMT is naturally present. The beta-carbolines are naturally present. See, I think the human organism is possibly a 1 or 2 gene mutation away from, it's hard to describe, but from being able to see the morphogenetic field, that the Tao could be made somehow visible, and it would just require what Kathleen is referring to, a very slight alteration in our neurochemistry. And I think we are placing our...
Right, because I was working with this thing when I was rebirthing the other morning about the fact that what is the quote we say, seeing is believing. Well, actually, if we turn it around, believing is seeing, or believing is perceiving, because what we are open to, what we believe in inside ourselves, projects out into our world. And those of us who are self-selective, and that we have chosen to believe in this hyperdimension, will experience it.
Yes, I think we're building a consensus for a new world, and it's a world that will be built of consensus. So we're taking a primary step.
This is going to affect everybody at once, whether they believe it or not, or whether they expect it or not.
Well, that's...
Easier on some.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a hallucination with teeth. It's
the
a...
only kind of prophecy that ever works is self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's right. It's a true hallucination.
You know, we've saturated the room with what's going to happen after 2012. Wouldn't it be a good idea to throw the Yarrow sticks? Weren't you talking earlier about...
Yeah, where are we in real time?
The
What?
20th.
536.
Well, why don't we now, having talked about this, throw the I Ching and pose the question, you can help, I'm just trying to formulate it, give us an image of the time which lies beyond the end of the wave. Is that the consensus? Give us an image. And let's do this sucker right this time.
By the way, I saw Nick Herbert's book in the Bodhi Tree the other day. It's already out.
Faster Than Light, it's out. Did they use a quote from me on the back? I haven't seen it.
That I don't know.
And some of you missed a very interesting thing that went on the other day. I can't remember who it was. It was you, I believe, who added the wrinkle of you save up the sticks and divide them by 4.
Yes, you were saying that if you have a certain number, you're taking away one, you take some from one pile, some from another, and then there's a code that 8 equals 2.
Yeah, and you showed how to overcome it.
There's a more direct way to do it in that when you've done your mutations, your 3 mutations, and you've got them separated, you can total them all up. And then from the 49, you subtract the number of sticks you've taken away, and you have a remainder. That's divided by 4, and you arrive at 9, 8, 7, or 6.
This is a neat trick. It may sound complicated. It's actually a simplification. I'll throw, and somebody can narrate, and let's have agreement this time on what all this means, and I'll do it your
Do we
way.
want to talk through this one, or should we just kind of ease it through?
Let's see if we can to talk it through. Okay. Not as much as before.
So what do? You put them into piles of...
We put them into piles of 10.
That's just to see if they're all there, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then we remove 1.
Could you tell us what you're going to do?
Yes.
Yeah.
Then we combine them. We clearly conceive the question, which is a picture of the conditions after the termination of the wave and a comment on that. Randomly divide 1 from here. The first one will be 5 or 9. We're counting off by 4. It is 5. And we save it off. Now we're going to get a 8 or a 4.
This is by your experience or by just, it's the way you can?
Always.
Okay.
Always. And it's a 4. This will be an 8 or a 4. And it is a 4. Now, applying the new method, we count these.
New method.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And we subtract it from 49
And get 36.
and get 36, which we divide by 4, and we get 9. So the first line is a 9, which is a moving yang. Okay, second line. Second line. Everything is returned. Count off by 4. This will be a 4 or a 9. I'm sorry, a 5 or a 9. And it is clearly a 5. Second throw. This will be a 4 or an 8. And it is a 4. Third cast. These are called casts, actually, not throws. The whole thing is called a throw. This will be a 4 or an 8, and it is a 4. 4, 4, and 5. 8 and 5 is 15. 13 from, from 49 is 36, so that's 9 again.
Another moving yang?
Another moving,
This is our second line.
that's our second line.
Okay.
Here comes the third line.
Did you announce the question at all? Or
Yes, the question is, give a picture of the situation off the end of the wave. What lies
great.
beyond the end of the wave? Okay, here we go. 1, count off by 4. This will be a 5 or a 9. Okay, it's clearly a 5. This will be a 4 or an 8. And it is clearly a 4. This will be a 4 or an 8.
Are you alternating 4, 8, 5, 9, or how are you, when you make that statement at the beginning?
No, it's the first one of each one is a 9 or a 5, and the other two are a 4 or an 8. Okay, so this was to be a 4 or an 8, and it's an 8.
So you alternate between those?
No, the first one is a 9 or a 5, and the last two are 4s or 8s. Okay, so what have we got? We've got 8, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 from 49
It's 32.
divided by 4,
It's 8.
8. So that's
Moving yen.
an
No,
8.
no, no, it's a record yen. It's
Y-
Solid remains solid.
It's
Young.
solid. It's a young
Young yen.
yen. Young yen. Okay, fourth line.
It's a what?
Young
Eight
yen
says,
line.
I've got solid remains solid.
Oh, we didn't clear it up
Yes.
last night, did
Yes.
we? Did we clear it up?
I'm still
No, we-
using what was given the other day.
We changed it though, remember?
No.
Seven.
Uh-uh.
No, we've got it. We've got it right.
It's a solid yen line, or it's an unmoving.
Right, it's a young yen.
It's an unmoving yen.
There you go, like this, right?
That's right. That's right.
You see, there was some information that was twisted yesterday, but this is how it is.
Well, can we get it
Unmoving yen.
clear?
Okay, that's not what.
Yeah, we'll talk about it when we finish. Okay, now we're going for the
Fourth line.
fourth line. Okay. This is the ruler of the hexagram.
And this is still a 5 or a 9?
Yeah, this will be a 5 or a 9. Okay, and it's a 5.
I must have missed it.
Okay, that's a 5. Now here's the second cast for the fourth line. And it's a 4 or an 8, and it's clearly a 4. Third cast, fourth line. And it's an 8. 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Gives 32. Divided by 4 is 8 again. Everybody got it? Okay. I'm sorry, it's the fifth line, which is the ruler.
That's why I was wondering or something.
Why are you so shy? You should...
Well,
because...
What are you talking about? You're supposed to leap up and to...
if you want it, you'll get it.
No, I don't presume expertise. I got roped into this.
Well, I'm trying to find out what the...
Okay, now this is a 5 or a 9. Okay, it's a 5. And this time it'll be a 4 or an 8. Or an 8. And it's clearly a 4.
You're on the sixth line
No, aren't we on the
Fifth.
fifth line?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Okay, and that's clearly an 8. Okay, so what have we got? We've got 8 and 4 is 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. This one also is an 8. So have the scribes got it? Okay, now the top line, the last lines.
Now, if it comes out to be a 7, is that a solid that does not move? Is that,
Yeah,
okay.
After you randomly divide the sticks, you always pull one from the right.
that's right.
So we have the lake on the bottom here. We have 2 here on the bottom already.
Mm-hmm. The youngest daughter.
Right, the joyful one.
Okay, we've got a 5. Now, second cast, 6th line. And it's a 4. Third cast, 6th line.
Well, there's, no. To get the number, he has to do the process at least. Was it 3 times?
Okie doke, it's a
I don't know,
4. So now what have we got? We've got a 4, and a 4 is an 8. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 is 9. 9.
Alright.
Okay, somebody tell us what we've got, and I'll read it out.
No moving lines this time?
No, there were 3 moving lines.
Number 41.
Top
It's-
one's moving.
It's
Bottom
41.
Yes, 41.
Okay, 41
Wheel of Fortune, 41.
is decrease.
Oh, and the change is remarkable.
What is the change?
It's cooling the earth.
What is the number?
What's the number?
Number 2.
Oh,
So it's 41.
oh, it changes to the receptive.
2.
Yeah.
And that's what's changed?
Cooling the earth.
Those of us who were afraid it would make a mistake, relax. All right, here we go. Sun, 41, decrease. Above, Ken, keeping still, mountain. Below, Tui, the joyous lake. This hexagram represents a decrease of the lower trigram in favor of the upper, because the third line, originally strong, has moved up to the top, and the top line, originally weak, has replaced it. What is below is decreased to the benefit of what is above. This is out-and-out decrease. If the foundations of a building are decreased in strength and the upper walls are strengthened, the whole structure loses its stability. Likewise, a decrease in the prosperity of the people in favor of the government is an out-and-out decrease. And the entire theme of the hexagram is directed towards showing how this shift of wealth can take place without causing the sources of wealth in the nation and its lower classes to fail. The judgment, decrease, combined with sincerity, brings about supreme good fortune without blame. One may be persevering in this. It furthers one to undertake something. How is this to be carried out? One may use 2 small bowls for the sacrifice. Decrease does not under all circumstances mean something bad. Increase and decrease come in their own time. What matters here is to understand the time and not to try to cover up poverty with empty pretense. If a time of scanty resources brings out an inner truth, one must not feel ashamed of simplicity, for simplicity is then the very thing needed to provide the inner strength for further undertakings. Indeed, there need be no concern if the outward beauty of the civilization, even the elaboration of religious forms, should have to suffer because of simplicity. One must draw on the strength of the inner attitude to compensate for what is lacking in externals. Then the power of the content makes up for the simplicity of form. There is no need of presenting false appearances to the Tao. Even with slender means, the sentiment of the heart can be expressed. And then the image, and you should bear in mind that much of this commentary is centuries later than the book itself, and there are old and new strata. The image, at the foot of the mountain, the lake, the image of decrease. Thus the superior man controls his anger, superior person controls anger and restrains instincts. The lake at the foot of the mountain evaporates. In this way it decreases to the benefit of the mountain, which is enriched by its moisture. The mountain stands as the symbol of a stubborn strength that can harden into anger. The lake is the symbol of unchecked gaiety that can develop into passionate drives at the expense of the life forces. Therefore, decrease is necessary. Anger must be decreased by keeping still. The instincts must be curbed by restriction. In this decrease of the lower powers of the psyche, the higher aspects of the soul are enriched. Okay, then we go into the commentary on the lines, and there was a 9 at the beginning?
We have 2 moving lines there, both the first and second, and of course the very last one's moving, so.
Okay, so of the 6 lines, 3 are moving. And these are considered to be the important part of the commentary, because this is what links one hexagram to the other and characterizes the state of change. 9 at the beginning means Going quickly when one's tasks are finished is without blame, but one must reflect on how much one may decrease others. It is unselfish and good when a person, after completing their own urgent tasks, uses their strength in the service of others, and without bragging or making much of it, helps quickly where help is needed. But the person in a superior position who is thus aided must weigh carefully how much they can accept without doing the helpful servant or friend real harm. Only where such delicacy of feeling exists can one give oneself unconditionally and without hesitation. 9 in the second place means perseverance furthers. To undertake something brings misfortune. Without decreasing oneself, one is able to bring increase to others. A high-minded self-awareness and a consistent seriousness with no forfeit of dignity are necessary if a person wants to be of service to others. One who throws themselves away in order to do the bidding of a superior diminish their own position without giving lasting benefit to the other. This is wrong. To render true service of lasting value to another, one must serve that other without relinquishing oneself. And the top line, 9 at the top, means if one is increased without depriving others, there is no blame. Perseverance brings good fortune. It furthers one to undertake something. One obtains servants but no longer has a separate home. There are people who dispense blessings to the whole world. Every increase in power that comes to them benefits the whole of mankind and therefore does not bring decrease to others. Through perseverance and zealous work, a man wins success and finds helpers as they are needed. But what he accomplishes is not a limited private advantage. It is a public good and available to everyone. And then the change is to the receptive, which is composed of all broken lines and is one of the great meditations of the I Ching. There were versions of the I Ching at one point which placed this as the primary hexagram. Above Kun, the receptive earth. Below Kun, the receptive earth. This hexagram is made of broken lines only. The broken line represents the dark, yielding, receptive, primal power of Yin. The attribute of the hexagram is devotion. Its image is the earth. It is the perfect complement of the creative. The complement, not the opposite. For the receptive does not combat the creative, but completes it. It represents nature in contrast to spirit, earth in contrast to heaven, space as against time, the female maternal as against the male paternal. However, as applied to human affairs, the principle of this complementary relationship is found not only in the relationship between man and woman, but also in that between prince and minister, and between father and son. Indeed, even in the individual, this duality appears in the coexistence of the spiritual world and the world of the senses. But strictly speaking, there is no real dualism here, because there is a clearly defined hierarchic relationship between the two principles. In itself, of course, the receptive is just as important as the creative, but the attribute of devotion defines the place occupied by this primal power in relation to the creative, for the receptive must be activated and led by the creative. Then it is productive of good. Only when it abandons this position and tries to stand as an equal by the side of the creative does it become evil. The result then is opposition and struggle against the creative, which is productive of evil to both. And I'll just read the judgment and not the exegesis. The judgment. The receptive brings about sublime success, furthering through the perseverance of a mare. If the superior man undertakes something and tries to lead, he goes astray, but if he follows, he finds guidance. It is favorable to find friends in the west and south, to forego friends in the east and north. Quiet perseverance brings good fortune. So that's the gist of it. What I find interesting about it is simply that it places an immersion into the feminine at the end. That's what's happening. We are going into the realm of the unconscious. We are moving into the imagination, a kind of value dark dimension. This is the world of the creative, the world of the striving of novelty against habit. And the transcendence, the flip over, is into the world of the accomplished Tao of the feminine. At least that would be my interpretation.
Would it repeat itself on the other side of that zero axis?
Well, that's one way of thinking of it, but I don't think so. I think that it liberates from the constraints which this pictures, and those constraints cease to exist, and we become, objects in our collective imagination. Well, that's it for today.
Thank you.
I'll be around this evening, and maybe Peter will agree to be around for part of this evening, and people who want to use this program, we will help you if you need help.
Can you make maybe a very small manual of the directions,
I have a beautiful manual of the directions, and I'll bring it down on my way to dinner, and I'll leave it on top of the computer. And that's a full manual explaining all functions of the program.
So you're meeting tonight here?
No, it's informal.
Just
I
informal.
will be available
Right.
for people who need help with the computer, people who want to go to the baths. I applaud their decision.
Are you meeting are you meeting at 8 here?
Yeah, I'll be here between 8 and 9, I'll say.
There's no evening session tonight.
Yeah, I understand.
But I'll be
What
here
it is
between
gonna
8 and
be,
9.
yeah.
You're very... Some of you have been asking about is catalogs of tapes and schedules of future events. So I'll just put these out here or out the front door. And if you need to order tapes or the Mushroom Grower's Guide or True Hallucinations or this software, by the way, you can get the software, but only for these machines, the 2E, 2C, 2GS line. But there is that promo, and I'll also, let's see, what have we got here? I'll put out promo for Botanical Dimensions, which is the project that Kat and I founded in Hawaii, a tropical botanical garden to preserve plants from all over the world that have a history of human usage in shamanism and healing. And it's not that removed from the concerns of this meeting, as I'll probably show before the meeting is over. But if you're interested in that work, why, there's promo for that. And then there's a company with which I have nothing whatsoever to do, except that I know these people, a company that has begun selling plants with a history of shamanic usage, and plants from all over the world. And they asked me to distribute their plant list, and so I'm doing that for them. So anyway, all this stuff will be laid out there, and you can examine it if you wish.
Terrence, did you mention that there might be a bibliography available?
I hope I didn't. A recommended reading. Didn't I? Oh, well, when I referred to the recommended reading list, I meant that under the description in the catalog, it recommended the invisible landscape and the I Ching. There are still invisible landscapes in that Xeroxed form if anybody wants them. Okay.
Also, that Genesis and Evolution of Time.
Oh, Fraser's book.
Have we discussed that at all so far? I don't remember hitting on that yet.
No, we haven't discussed it. Basically, the reason I put that on the reading list is because he's a very hard-headed science type who tries to deconstruct the Western assumptions about time and then rebuild them. And he comes to surprisingly radical conclusions that have a certain parallelism to these ideas. So it was with that in mind that I recommended that. There aren't that many books about time that really get down on it. The book that I have most in mind when I build metaphysical assumptions in these situations is Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. And if you haven't read it, you certainly should read it. Then you'll find out about process and reality.
300 pages?
It's challenging. Think of it that way. After all, you can throw away your Sanskrit dictionary. You know? Okay. How many people since yesterday's lectures have had a chance to interact with the software? And so, was it satisfying, or how did it seem? I would like feedback, impressions on the fairly practical level of, is this kind of thing worth pursuing, or does it just seem like smoke?
Well, I could tell you what happened. Remember we discovered this pattern here that had occurred last year,
Right.
around early autumn. It seems we're heading for another similar pattern in March-February period of next year.
This is in your life.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And so we started blowing it up, and unlike the earlier pattern, we're going to have a spike bottom. And the earlier pattern, we had a plateau, so we were exploring this novelty for 48 hours. While this spike might last, 3-4 hours on, we got it down to March 9th at 7 a.m. So whatever is going to occur is...
Get up, phone your broker.
Exactly. Now, to double check on your system, we took his life, and we blew up that same temporal topography, the same time and hour, same day, and while I'm going down Niagara Falls in a paper cup, he's following in complacency during the same period. So.
Well, just compare your portfolios, and what he has that you have, you don't have to worry about. What you have that he doesn't have, you should probably look at closely.
Anyway, that's the gist of it.
Well, as a cross-check, I was tapping in different points in time that I recognized in my life as being significant, and I could not relate to them at all. And so then I backtracked and realized that the formula you had of your birthday, add 104 days, add 67 years, as the formula, I'd misadded by a year, because I'd added the years and I'd added the days, but I hadn't figured that since I was born a year, it went through another year, so I was minus a year. Then I retapped that in, and I wanted to focus in on where the peak of the crest was, and I keep track of events in my life, and I remember them pretty well, and so I was just going down and saying, oh, spring of 75, yes, this happened, this happened, this happened, and it was hitting points and crests and bottoms all along the way. Sometimes I didn't think of them as the way that they were described, but there were correspondences all down the line. Except there were points where I couldn't figure out why there was a peak. There was a completely insignificant part of my life, and I don't have any grab on that one. But it did seem like it fit really well.
But generally it fit. Yes, well, it is interesting that when you miscalculate, it doesn't work. That's how I got it positioned the way I did, because I wanted, I had this very strong intuition that the beginning of each cycle would begin with a resonance of the Big Bang, which started out the physical universe. And the obvious candidate for that event in the 20th century, I thought, was probably Hiroshima, which was, you know, the first use of a nuclear weapon against a human population. And when it was set on August the 5th, 1945, the terminus was, I don't know, within a couple of weeks of this Mayan calendrical conclusion in 2012. And so then, working off that and just moving it around, it finally seemed clear that the best fit of the data is to the Mayan end date. I mean, it just seems, it's uncanny, actually. But you know, it wouldn't bother me if there was a devil's advocate in the group. I mean, I'm very puzzled by, is it something about pattern? Is it something about the relationship of the human mind-brain system to the exterior world? It really seems freakish to me on one level that a thing like this would work at all. And then, of course, there's another level of argument where I suppose, you know, if the natural world is made of fractals, then there must be fractals embedded in fractals, and we're just simply topping out at the top level of the descriptive system, and that is this very large overlay into which everything else is fit.
How's that different, or does it resemble Bohm's idea of implicate and order, those two levels of order?
Well, the way in which the ideas are similar to his ideas and pre-Brahms is that, you see, holograms, which is the banner they're flying under, are fractals. The strange thing about a hologram is that when you cut it in two and illuminate half of it, the whole thing is still there. And when you cut it again and again and again, the resolution of the image is slowly lost, but no portion of the image is entirely lost. The whole thing slowly fades away. Well, this is a fractal quality, you see. It means that the information to make the image is somehow at all levels within the physical hologram. So, one of the conclusions that I draw from the kind of theory that I put to you yesterday is that time is a kind of hologram, that this business with the first level, the first order of difference, where we build the wave out of a forward-moving sequence of hexagrams placed against a backward-moving sequence of hexagrams, what that says to me is interference pattern. That's what you get when you oppose two streams. And, for instance, I've vividly experienced what are called standing waves. Standing waves are when two wave mechanical phenomena collide, and the mutual interference of their forward momentum creates a highly disequilibrious state that is maintained. And what I mean by that is, for instance, at where the Putumayo joins the Amazon. I've been there in small boats, and where the flow of these two enormous rivers, each at that point more than 2 miles across, where they flow together, there's a hump in the water about 5 feet high, and it stays there. It's a permanent feature of the scene. It is a standing wave created by the mechanical energy of these two streams coming together. And it moves slightly within a parameter, but it's always there. So I think the present is something like this, that we are well acquainted because of our intellectual biases with the mechanics of forward-moving casuistry, the chain of cause and effect. That is what science is about. It's what Buddhism was very concerned to delineate, so forth and so on. What we are not, what we don't have an equal intellectual perception of is the backward flowing attractor that imparts telos, meaning purpose.
Can you define attractor for us?
Well, it's something which attracts,
Right,
obviously.
right.
I mean, all vectors swing toward it, and it exercises an influence over, the mathematical term is, its domain.
So it's like a source for field generation.
That's right. Just think of it as a magnet.
Okay.
The magnet is the attractor. Its magnetic field is its domain of attraction. And at the boundary of domains of attraction, there is turbulence.
Interference patterns.
Interference patterns, chaotic states, traveling catastrophes, chaostrophes.
Okay, from what I gather from your talk then, I mean, the two rivers as they head towards a bifurcation, or I don't know what. Confluence. It seems that you're just seeing that, though, at a snapshot in time. Obviously, somehow, as more time passes, the organizing principle changes because the structure changes. Somehow a new interference pattern is introduced.
Well, the river metaphor can only take you so far. I mean, because of this collapse factor of 64 that is built into this thing, it has the character of a spiral with closure, where each level is 1/64th of a larger modality in which it is embedded, and the whole thing is wound up and moving toward a conclusion. Now, it's interesting, it's the Western religions that have always had this fascination with a conclusion, and it's the Eastern point of view largely that has emphasized the spiral and recursive nature of time. Especially in Hinduism you get this, where kiliokalpas of time are talked about, and they had a notion of deep time that makes even modern geology seem pale stuff. I mean, they were not adverse to talking about kiliochasms of trillions of years. But what this notion does is, it seems to me that it makes peace with both of these concepts, because what you have is the round, the cycling. Every 67 years a cycle, every 4,306 years a cycle, every 384 days a cycle, and so forth. But these cycles are embedded in a much larger piece of mathematical machinery that is not a cycle at all, but which moves toward an absolute and unique zero point, a point that occurs once only in all of the fractal explosion of the wave. There is only one point that contains the zero, and so that's the place where, that's the umbilicus of the phenomenal aura that surrounds the hologram of this standing wave. And why? Well, I'm not sure that there are ultimate whys. It's, yeah.
You arrived at this either by Hiroshima or by the Mayan calendar, the end point, right?
No, actually not by the Mayan calendar. After using Hiroshima as the beginning of the last 67-year cycle.
That was totally arbitrary, was it?
Well, it was a hunch, because I felt that the use of the atomic bomb was a resonance to the Big Bang.
Well, supposing you take the 67 period prior to Hiroshima.
Uh-huh.
Do you use that very same configuration?
Well, you find the place in the wave that is right for it and blow it up. I can do that for you.
Well, how do you find the place that's right for it? Because if it's a 67-year cycle, why doesn't the previous 67 years fit exactly the same configuration?
Because they are overlaid over a much larger curve which imparts different values to each of the subsectors. So it is the same set of values over and over again, but occurring superimposed over a much larger mathematical form, which is distorting and changing the shape of the original set of values.
But you can take any life. I mean, it could be a life in the 19th century or the
Sure.
18th century, and do it exactly the same way as you do a life in the 20th century.
That's right.
With 67 years.
Right. We could look, for instance, at the life of Alexander the Great or something like that. You know, we know he committed suicide at the age of 23 after conquering the world. It must be an
He didn't.
26.
He died of a fever.
Yes.
Suicide. No, I don't know.
He
I
died
heard
of
suicide.
No, it was like a great, like a consumption or something. It was a feverish experience. His generals were all around him in his deathbed. That's what I read.
I thought poison was suspected,
No,
and there
well-
had been a Bactrian barmaid in the picture in the previous 24 hours, and that the coroner forged the death papers. The newspapers kept it quiet.
Without going to a lot of work, can you give me a simple explanation as to how 1933, say, or 1920, or anything else? How do you get the fit on?
Yes, you want me to? Well, here, I'll stride to the chart and explain and frustrate Paul here. No, I'll keep this on. Okay. Well, if we think of this as the period from 1945 to 2012, then obviously we can find any place after 1945 on it. But your question is, where, for example, is 1933? Is that right?
Or anything prior.
Or anything prior. Well, it's clearly not on here if we think of this as 45 to 2012, but when we can't find it at one level, we have to shift conceptual levels. If we say, I can't find it when I think of this as 67 years, then go to the next highest level. Then you say, well, this is now 4,306 years, and in that case, 1933 is about right there.
Oh, I see.
See?
I said
But-
smaller scale, in other words.
Yes, but that doesn't impede your ability to understand it, because having located it here, you can now blow it up and fill the screen with it. See, thinking of this as 4,306 years, you're getting the pyramids down here. Well, this is maybe a good time to talk about this. If you think of this as 4,306 years, roughly, just to give you an image, here's what you've got. The pyramids here being built, the pyramid at Giza, 2790. Here, the destruction of Minoan Crete by Mycenaean piracy. Here, Periclean Athens. Here, Christ and Tiberius. Here, the fall of the Roman Empire. And all subsequent time here, the European Enlightenment here, the 20th century here. Now, if you think of this as 67 years, ending in 2012,
You've got to blow it up.
well, you start back over here and you say, what's here? Well, this is about 1938. Now, the notion is that the rise of National Socialism in Germany, the style, motif, and psychology of fascism has a relationship to the patriarchal, pharaonic, symbol-laden religion of dynastic Egypt. Not dynastic Egypt, of the Old Kingdom. In other words, in this theory, that's what's called a resonance. That the pre-existing Egyptian theocratic superstate, which was a cult of a leader, a living God, and this whole rigmarole. I'm sure you're familiar with it. In modern terms, translates into the fascism of Germany in the 1930s. And the idea is that we go through, we relive all the themes, concerns, obsessions in some form of the previous cycle. So, well,
So we're going to talk about what's coming up soon. I mean, so we can see.
Well, yeah. Let me flash to the top here. Remember, on the 4,300-year cycle, this is Minoan Crete, squashed by Mycenaean solar paternalism and city-building piratical types from continental Europe, from Greece. Okay, in the 20th century, this is the period 66, 67, 68, which I think clearly, from the point of view of the social history of the United States, was the period where, you know, the doors were all thrown open. That's when people began to play with a full deck. And the previous post-war complacency, the Eisenhower thing and all this, the McCarthy witch hunts and all this constipated this.
Now that's also the period when psychedelics were discovered. You're talking about Albert Hoffman and...
No, that was discovered in 37 down here in the Nazi Egypt period.
Getting into the 50s there, you're talking about...
Well, it's not all black and white. I mean, look at these steep descents into novelty. These were exciting times. It's just that now, from the perspective of millennia, we see that the general trend was yuck.
Where is Auschwitz and Hiroshima?
Well, Auschwitz.
Well, it's kind of a period of years, though, right?
Yes.
No.
Well, but it's a
44.
Right, but let's use Hiroshima, because we know that at 20 minutes after 8 a.m. on the morning of, you know, well, it's right here.
Auschwitz?
No, Hiroshima. And if we had the rest of this, it goes down a bit more.
Can you point on the big one right there? Is it possible, Terrence, to point on the big one?
Sure, but it's not. It's right here. It's this little V there.
Well, could you answer me just once more the question? You've now got 4,000 years on that chart. You're picking the year 1933 one. Now, how do you place the 67 configuration on 1933?
You use the values behind this. In other words, imagine that behind this there's another picture. The line just continues, and it does a different thing. This is what we can show you on the computer. Perhaps I should just...
You mean that actually overlaid would fit? Is that what you mean?
That's right, that this continues into the next frame. And goes back, and then there is another frame and another, and there are 384, I'm sorry, there are 64 such frames, and we can generate them all on the computer. That's what the program does.
Isn't this Hiroshima right here, though? That little point right there?
Yeah.
See, this is the big picture right here.
Well, where are you pointing? I mean, this is the mid-30s here.
Isn't that Hiroshima right there?
I think so. Let's put it on the screen.
Because that's the telling this part right here.
Let me see here.
See, this is where the square is right there. So that's Hiroshima right there, that low point.
Okay, now you can put it back on.
I'm going to have to...
You think that's what we're talking about? So he talks about going off the screen, and that's the low point.
What bothers me about its chart of the last part of the century is that during the last 8 or 12 years, I would have expected quite a jump back up into habituation and a drop of novelty.
During which 10 years?
During the late 70s and the 80s today, because of the Reagan era, it seems like a descend into conservatism and habituation.
Well, but I think in turn, see, it depends on where you think it depends on what you think matters. In other words, I can see your point. On the other hand, superconductivity, advances of all sorts in cybernetics. I think that when I try and figure out what does the wave seem to be tracking most closely, where is it least wrong, it's in the area of technology and tool making. And I suggested this yesterday. We don't know how important it is that Ronald Reagan was president. I mean, perhaps the fact that the ozone layer was dissolving while he was president was much more important than anything he ever said, did, or thought. You know?
There also seems to be a tendency to focus on either America or Western Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, there were other things happening at the time Rome was falling. That was the age of the Gupta kings in India. That was kind of a golden age.
Well, but on the other hand, the Han Dynasty was being torn apart by internal uprisings at the very moment that the Roman Empire was sliding into chaos.
What I'm saying is that, you know, you can pick one date in history and say, okay, what was happening there? Well, it depends on not only what you think is important, but where you're looking.
That's right.
You can find almost anything with any date if you look hard enough.
Yes, this is, and I'm glad you brought this up, this is something we should talk about, and all other potential criticisms of this. But this is a good one. The problem is that history, which is to be the data field that will be used to prove or disprove this contention, is itself not a quantified thing. I mean, on a scale of 100, how do you compare the Mayan classic period with the Greek classic period? I mean, it's this crazy kinds of questions. There are no answers for this kind of thing. So ultimately, the criticism that can be leveled against this is that whether you think it works or not is in the eye of the beholder. You know, it depends on your relationship to data, expectation, so forth and so on. I mean, I suppose a National Socialist who thought that classical Greece was a period when fairies and airheads broke out of control and it should have been suppressed would look at the graph and say, well, then it's wrong. It doesn't fit my theory of history because it assigns a value, it makes a value judgment on this historical epoch which I reject. So because there is no consensus about history, we're sort of left up in the air, except there's such an odd thing about this idea, which is that it has this built-in unavoidable test. The test implied by December the 22nd, 2012. If that moment just comes and goes, and history, you know, we're still staring into the face of self-compounded hopelessness, well then this will take its place with the flat earth and ceremonial magic and, yeah.
I don't know if it does track the development of technology and tool making. Technology and tool making are amoral. You know, they just operate, and then whoever has them in their hands uses them according to their capacities as a human being. So in that case, it could be very accurate. It could be very accurate, and that seems like more of a handle to get on this rather than any value we put upon an ethic.
You mean that we would maybe possibly able to more impartially evaluate that than advance of religious ideas or something like that?
And then the zero point could be some transition to, let's say, some human-based, beyond technology, something where we're more in a psychic realm or something. Maybe
well, I guess you weren't here yesterday afternoon. We got into how, yes, that the ultimate tool was this union of mind and matter, where the two opposites, well, we spoke of history as an alchemical process where what is happening on the downslope of this graph is we're cooking the philosopher's stone, you know, discovering the elements, discovering nuclear chemistry, DNA, cybernetics, and this program to produce the philosopher's stone has never actually left the agenda of the more radically romantic branch of science. And now it manifests as the flying saucer. The flying saucer is this anticipation of this transcendentalized state of thinking matter that seems to be what our cultural destiny pushes toward. And I think that's what's being made there. The Mandayans, who were this bizarre religion that arose around Jerusalem a few years before Christ. In fact, they claim in some of their scriptures to be derivative of John the Baptist's original followers. They're a baptismal cult with a kind of super orthodoxy. I mean, they had rules such as if the eye of a Mandayan falls on an unbeliever, then you are ostracized from the group. And an unbeliever meant anybody who wasn't a Mandayan, which they did. I don't know. They had.
How they interact with the world?
There was one profession which was sanctioned, by which they could do commerce with the rest of the world, which was they smithed silver. And they wandered in the Middle East to Lebanon, and then they eventually ended up in the swamps of Iraq and Iran. But anyway, they're a very old Gnostic remnant, and they have this fascinating idea of a Messiah. And the Messiah comes and builds a machine. That's what the Messiah, and they're very explicit about that a machine accompanies the messianic mission. And what the machine does is it pumps the light of souls to the moon, and then to Venus, and then to the sun, and then out of the solar system into some awesome and unimaginable source from which it all is to have come. But the fascinating thing about this is this insistence on a kind of mechanistic intervention, an actual object that must be built. Yeah, Deus ex machina, literally. It's interesting because at one point I thought that in the phase when I believed that the mushrooms were an extraterrestrial intelligence and that this kind of temporal modeling was an effort for a higher dimensional mind to kind of intersect with a human mind, I thought that that the message within the mushroom might be actually a kind of unfolding of technological ability, because it's interesting that at every stage of human advance, in these early critical junctures, the mushrooms were present, like in the movement from vegetarianism to pack hunting. The mushrooms were present then in the dung of these ungulate cattle, and then in the transition from pastoralism to agriculture, the mushrooms were there. It's all about working with dung and cattle, and the implicit thing there, you see, is mushrooms, and it leads on to one cultural stage to another, almost as though the mushroom contains the blueprints for a kind of device. But it takes 10 or 15,000 years and a number of prototypes, like the wheel, the internal combustion engine, and so forth, before you actually figure out what is in there. That's why I called this idea an analogical engine, because I really believe it's a kind of propulsion system for moving in a syntactical dimension. It's the notion that you could talk yourself to heaven.
But isn't this process something that reoccurs every so often? Like, would that be a parallel to the Ark of Noé and the end of Atlantis or Lemuria and things like this? And in this process where you kind of condense it to the marble, maybe there is a part of the souls that are propelled into another dimension as a certain mass is now starting a new process, and kind of like the DNA, you know, so each time you go into another circle, there is something is expelled, but then it still continues, and in that respect 2012 would be also another critical moment where a part of the souls would go under this tremendous transformation, but then, you know, it doesn't mean it's the end of human life on the planet. It still could just start a new cycle that until, you know, the growth is kind of illimited.
Right, well, this question of whether there's one cycle or each cycle is part of many is, you know, it's not possible to resolve it. There's no way to know. Sort of the way I interpret these things like Noah and Atlantis and the things you mentioned is that this one unique transcendental event that is still ahead of us somewhere in the planetary future is the cause of all the visionary and mystical anticipations that, you know, Atlantis didn't rise and fall in the past. It will rise and fall in the future. And all of these things which we place in the distant past are actually echoes from this transcendental object that, and what history is the unraveling through the intercession of the Tao. I mean, you could call it the unraveling or the witnessing to the unraveling, since I don't think it depends on us, but the unraveling of the secret that there is, you know, that history moves toward a resolution, a transcendence of itself. It can't be like this forever. It hasn't been like this forever. This is something so new. It's like yesterday people stopped, you know, beating each other over the head with fruits. And then this, you know, a 25,000 year march toward some kind of self-generated cultural omega point where technologies, imaging of our own neural capacity, metaphysics, all of this stuff is just turns incandescent as we, and yet, you know, people say nothing is happening.
Right.
That it's all totally ordinary, that it's just humdrum and ho-hum.
Because they can't see the past, you know, they're so...
They have no idea how different this is.
Exactly, yeah.
This is different.
They think this is every day, always has been, and it's like, I'm always marveling at how we were able to do things. And it's like, because I can see a ways back to where, like I said, we were just banging each other with sticks or rocks or rotten fruit or whatever. Now we're doing this in this kind of space with these kinds of pieces of, even that was considered Stone Age 5 years ago.
5 years ago, right.
I consider it a marvel. I mean, I wish it would be faster too, but all this stuff is pretty amazing.
Francis.
Have you at any point in all of this become uneasy about the determinism implied?
Well, I've thought about it a lot. Here's what I say about that. An absolute determinism is, one, impossible, and two, to be avoided at all costs. The reason is, if the world were absolutely determined, then thought doesn't mean anything. I am thinking, if the world is absolutely determined, then I am thinking the thoughts I'm thinking because I can't think any others. It's just determined. So that puts philosophers out of business, and since I sort of identify with that, why, I'm very concerned to preserve free will. How I think of what this is doing is The previous model of time was basically that what you had to worry about mostly was cause and effect, the effect of your activity on the world, keep that clean and move forward. What this idea is saying is that the topology of time is not a flat surface, and that you can think of the Tao of your life as water, and it's moving over the temporal topology, the temporal landscape. But the temporal landscape is not a flat plane. It is in fact cut by mountains and uplifts and cliff systems, so that sometimes your life runs quickly and there is high novelty, and sometimes there are barriers and the flow is slowed. But the actual events which constitute the realization of the potential of novelty or its absence are freely determined. So in other words, here we have the chart and it's going along and it's flat, and now there's a huge drop on a certain day. And now we say, what do we know now? All we know is that on this certain day there's going to be a shift toward the novel. But we have no idea what the events will be that will fulfill this very generalized kind of prophecy.
And that's the problem. You keep saying, how do we know that this is really true and not just a marvelous conversational topic? The only way you can find out if it's true is to make a specific prediction that could not have been predicted any other way. You see something coming that nobody else sees, and then say, "Ha! I told you so," and then then you know you're right.
2012.
Well, I guess that will be 2012. You have to, the shift, you see, you can predict shift, but if someone demands that you predict content, then I don't think they understand how it works. If you could predict content, then the world would have to be seen as extremely highly determined. So what you predict is shift, and then if we can get an agreement on what that means before the test happens. So, all theories, this is a good general piece of information that somebody passed on to me, and I'm forever grateful. If somebody's pushing an idea at you, and you want to know just how reasonable and fair and so forth they are about this idea, then this is the question you ask. Under what circumstances would you agree that you are wrong? You see? Now, Freudians have never answered this question. Marxists are incapable of responding to this question. There are no circumstances under which Marxists and Freudians would feel constrained to abandon their theories. When you apply that question to this theory, you get levels of retraction. What if nothing happens in 2012 at all? Well, a hardline position would be that the wave was simply calibrated wrong, that only one thing was wrong with the theory, the end date, everything else still holds. Some of you may know there's a wonderful book called When Prophecy Fails. Have you ever read this book? It's by two Stanford sociologists who infiltrated a flying saucer cult in Utah. This woman's husband had died, and she had begun getting messages a few months after his death, and then a few months after that, Ouija board messages. And a few months after that, he handed her on to Commander Gamma, who was an extraterrestrial in orbit around this planet, who was planning to intervene for the good of mankind. And she gathered a very small group of people around her, including these two Stanford sociologists. And the messages became more and more intense, and finally it became about a meeting, and that it would occur at dawn on a certain day in a certain place in the Utah desert, and these people were just in a lather over this, and great excitement. They told no one. They told no one, and prepared and fasted, and finally they drove to the place where it was to happen. And as dawn rose over the desert, nothing happened. And they waited around until the sun was beating down, and then went back to headquarters to regroup. Well, they decided that they had obviously gotten the message wrong, and that this was the fallacy of being secretive, that they hadn't had enough people helping them figure out what was going on. So they voted and decided to immediately call a press conference and announce the entire thing, and their faith was redoubled, and they saw then that now they were going to get the aid of interested parties and publicity and so forth and so on. This is called the disconfirmational crisis, and it happened for Christianity as well, because of course Christ said, "This generation will not pass away before I will return among you." And people, the first 100 years of Christianity were just totally apocalyptic. But then the hotheads were swept away, and the managerial types and the MBAs got hold of it and said, "Let's squelch all this end of the world talk and do some serious investing here." And so my position vis-a-vis that is, I will be 65 years old a month before December 22nd, 2012. And at that point, I will retire. And I'll be perfectly happy to see this described, these histories of scientific ideas that have paragraphs that say things like, "The later 17th century saw a flowering of bizarre and eccentric scientific theories, of which so-and-so's is the most Baroque example." They can put me and Jose on the same shelf.
How do you determine that what we are undergoing now is so radically different from what happened, let's say, in Atlantis time, where they were supposed to also have reached a peak of civilization, where they were even in contact with extraterrestrial, they had psychic development and all that. And I think maybe they also experienced the same kind of a feeling that we have of compression, and that within a short period of time the evolution had undergone an exponential kind of a line.
Well,
what's the difference with us today?
The evidence for a super civilization in the past tends to be underwhelming. I would see it more as an anticipation of the future, of the record of history where we have some consensus, let's say from Çatalhöyük forward in the archaeological record, meaning the last 10,000 years, has never seen anything like this. I mean, this is something new, and the Earth will never again bring forth a civilization like this, because we have extracted all the near-surface metals. And there's no way, if we were sent back to the Stone Age, that a technological civilization could arise, because the near-surface metals have all been extracted in the last 1,000 years by our civilization. So when you look at things like, see, one way to think of it in talking about this density of connection thing, which is how we define novelty, is that information is undergoing some kind of of spontaneous orgy of self-replication and self-reflection. It's really, if you were an extraterrestrial standing off looking at this planet and running a historical movie in 10 minutes of the last million years, what you would see, you wouldn't see the emergence of human civilization and technology and like that. You would see new strategies of information transfer beginning to happen, culminating in bookmaking, printing, computers, spoken, sung, and thought language. It's almost as though syntax is what is alive. You know, sexuality itself, the way it works in higher mammals and the way it works in higher plants, the angiosperms, that all came into being at one moment in the past. There weren't higher plants. The higher plants emerged at around the same time as the emergence of mammals. And what these emergences represent are ever more efficient gene exchanges and gene mixing strategies. Well then, with human beings, it boils over out of the genetic into the epigenetic. We make songs, produce symbols, create myths, architectonic forms, books, and it's this binding of time, this, the whole career of organization in the cosmos can be seen as this almost octopoidal effort to bind one dimension to another, to keep condensing them, to bring the past into the present, to bring the future into the present, to bring that which is distant as though it were near, to create this holographic plenum throughout three-dimensional space. In other words, to overcome the limitation of three-dimensional space. And this is what drives shamanism, it's what drove human evolution, it's what drives language shifts, it's what should be lying behind the development and evolution of art. It's this transcendental striving which, when analyzed, turns out to be an effort to compress, interleave, and weave together the far and the near, the past and the present, the future and the present. And if you believe that each person's life is a microcosm of some larger pattern, in other words, the fractal faith, what exists as above, so below, a pattern here will have a resonance on a larger level, then why not believe that human history is like a stage in the gestation of this informational, syntactical species that is of some different order of magnitude than everything else going on this planet. I mean, we don't know what it's like to be part of a pheromone-regulated termite hive of millions of individuals, but we do know that the modalities that we create, you see, that's epigenetic communication. Pheromones, it's genetically based, but then locally variant. But our proclivity for this kind of thing, for the taking of raw matter and alchemically uniting it with ideas, with forms, these mysterious, invisible things impinging into our slice of time and space from some higher dimension, we take these intimations of eternity and unite them with matter and create these things which are made of meaning and of matter, of light and of intentionality. And this tool-making process, which then has all kinds of consequences rippling through the world of cultural effects, becomes the kind of continuing carrot for our appetition for future time. And, as I said, lying at the end of this is the tool which when correctly perceived is seen to be the self. You know, Carlos Castaneda, bless his heart, says you meet your double coming from another dimension. Well, the Mandayans had this same idea. They had this idea of this place called Misunya Kashta, which was the world of the light double. And at death, you approached the boundary condition, the edge of the attractor's domain, and entered into the turbulence, what I've called, in talking about psychedelic experiences, the billows, where you meet the incoming billows, this highly chaotic state that precedes the organized entry into the other. This
like surf, perhaps, going to the ocean, you encounter that surf out there. Is he talking about maybe?
Yeah, this is the same kind of thing. The smooth rise,
yeah.
And then
it's like you have to get through all that before you get there and ride the waves. You have to clear all that interference first.
And what about the Gaia theory that looks at the Earth as being in its period of still infancy?
Well, I mean, that's just one take of the Gaia thing. The mushroom once said to me, it was very touching. I mean, in fact, it was capable of moving me to tears, I guess because of the emotional import, but it said to me out of the blue, apropos of nothing, it said, you know, Terry, the Earth is old. And that was all, that was the statement. And it was this, you know, it just sort of hung on the air. I think that the Earth is not only a living, self-regulating organism, but in some bizarre way it is minded. I mean, it is aware. And we are, this is why, this has to do with this theory that I'm developing about how human beings are best, whatever that means, when regulated by plants. That it's very important for the relationship of human beings and plants to be very tight, because they are our managers in some sense. And what the anxiety of history and solar paternalism and dominance is about is the retreat first to a village surrounded by fields of food plants, which is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about wild, magical plants. And then the enlarging of that village into a city, which creates a whole new cultural dimension that is not about plants. And then the rise of male-driven priestcraft and hierarchy, which takes this plant, this ecstatic, orgiastic, goddess-oriented, dissolving, maternal hierophany, and suppresses it. This sets the stage for, you know, the immense cultural anxiety that we are heir to. And I really think that finding the Tao is not an imprecise notion. Finding the Tao means bringing these plants into your life and getting on the Gaia channel and beginning to discover and express the plan.
Right.
The planet has a plan. It's trying to communicate the plan. The problem is we've wandered away from the telephone, you know, and just are raving and don't realize, pick up the telephone, then you will hear what the plan is. And I don't mean, you know, a blanket advocacy of psychedelic plants. I mean, I do mean that, but I mean more. I mean being in nature, being in wilderness, opening yourself to starry nights and the movement of weather, and the planet is made of syntactical intentionality. I mean, don't ask me how this is possible. We'll figure that out later. The main thing is to wake up to the fact that this is true, that we are inside some kind of thing that is capable of having an I-thou relationship with us. I mean, it isn't like us, it's very different. If we were less naive by one iota, we would just call it Almighty God, I'm sure. But it is not the God who lit the stars and hung them like lamps in heaven. It isn't that. It's biology. It's biology on this planet has so many levels, so many strategies, so many niches of self-revealing. It's totally hubris for us to believe that we stare out through the only intelligent perceptors around. It's not like that. We are a catalyst. Every species has some role in the Gaian unfolding, and what we seem to be is a catalyst of some sort. We make change, fast, big, sudden change, and the planet, there are other things which make changes. Rivers, because they wander and destroy land and create open land where new plant species can then competitively enter. Before the arrival of fire-using man, rivers were the major forces creating speciation among plants. Glaciers mean change. I mean, a glacier can melt in 1,000 years. That's a human scale of impacting on an environment.
Wildfires, forest fires.
Yes, although geographers like Carl Sauer have actually argued that there is no such thing on this planet as a natural grassland, and that all grasslands are the artifact of human burning that goes back way, way back. And he has quite a theory about that, showing that the burning of forests promotes very unconsciously and effortlessly the evolution of cereals, and that the hunter-gatherers may have discovered, or this may have just been a self-reinforcing feedback loop.
But we have lightning cause fires, though, and that's how the heather balds, the rhododendron balds in the Smoky Mountains in Appalachia.
I'm not familiar with that ecosystem.
Yeah,
well, I'm not saying there weren't forest fires in the past, but I think large million-acre stuff only happens in an already human-impacted environment, unless there are special conditions. Yeah, Francis.
What about this notion that past, present, and future are all present at once, and the only reason we perceive time is because intentionally we run around in this self-existing hologram. The movement creates the sensation of time.
The sensation of duration.
So, would this make these things where you play the movie backwards and forwards sort of at the same time somehow and create these standing waves at points of intersection, just one of the possible camera angles?
That any position in the wave is one of the possible camera angles.
Or that these waves come out at all.
In all vectors.
In all vectors, so that the 64 I Ching might be just one account. There may be other 64s or 108s or whatever.
Possible configurations.
Yeah, so that this bumping along is
well, on
one
the
of many, or
it
has to do with the intentionality of movement of whatever, Homo sapiens or something.
Well, Plato said time is the moving image of eternity. This was one of his little aphorisms. And I sort of think of that in terms of this, that from a higher dimension, which is sort of what we're trying to do in this week, is actually very crudely visualize our own lives and history from a higher dimension. From a higher dimension, it's all not completed, because that brings up the determinism, but the plan is somehow all visible from this higher dimension. You can think of the plan as a black and white diagram, and the completed part of the plan as color moving through the black and white. So when you're in hyperspace looking at eternity, you see the present is the place where the color is moving into the black and white. Yes, Thomas Aquinas had this notion of what he called the nunc stans, the standing now, and it was caused by the past and the present interfering with each other. I mean, the past and the future interfering with each other and causing the present. So, do you know the philosophy of Leibniz, which is this philosophy of what he calls monads, which are tiny, tiny versions of the universe, each one complete within themselves, and they fill the universe in all directions. It's what's called a plenum. And I can imagine that each one of them might be a bound energy state described by this. So then you have this situation where it is complete at all points. It is somehow finalized, and yet there is the paradox of becoming. And a lot of philosophies have come to this point. I mean, in Buddhism, there is the problem of, there's the notion that if one person can attain enlightenment, then the phenomenal world will somehow be obviated. And yet, in the parinirvana, Buddha attained enlightenment. Well, so then what is this apparent continued existence of the phenomenal world if enlightenment was attained at some point in the past, and then you get a whole bunch of fancy theological discourse, but it revolves around the question of how come if something happened, the consequences of its effects are not visible, and what does that mean about time and so forth?
Well, you have what's known as the fourth moment in the Vajrayana Buddhism.
Explain.
Well, I don't know much about it. All I can tell you is what I've heard. But that's past, present, and future all contained.
Uh-huh.
So you think you're going horizontally, and they just put it down and put it out laterally.
So it's just moving off the grid in an orthogonal direction to all the other vectors.
Yeah, all time is present in this moment.
Uh-huh. Well, that's eternity.
Yeah, but we don't perceive that because we have intention and we have karma and so on, so we move around in that.
That's
and
right.
lay down lines, and
That's
those are the lines are our perception of time.
Right. Yes. And perception of time is driven by the organism. I mean, it is somehow a molecular phenomenon amplified and transduced through these enormous meaty bodies, but it's something that is happening because we're alive. Chairs do not, I think, experience time. And the funny thing about us, this is perhaps worth pursuing, when you cut into a chair, it doesn't change. When you cut into a living organism, you discover that everything is in cyclical movement. The essence of being an organism seems to be that a flow of energy is trapped in a form in a way that is not happening with a chair or a tennis ball or a stone. The metabolism is this mysterious process by which low-grade material, carbohydrates, sugars, and so forth, are taken inside the system, and an alchemical process of transduction then raises the level of complexity of this system, and physiological functions can be fueled out of the chemical cascades that are then created when these complex molecules that have been lifted to the top of this energy cycle are released and allowed to degrade, and then you get energy, the energy to move your body, to think and to feel. But the sensation of time is entirely rooted to the sensation of being alive and of being an organism. It's as though one way of thinking about this wave is that every person is one. I don't mean, as I taught you yesterday, every person can superimpose the wave over their life from birth to whenever. I mean that every person, you can think of yourself as this thing just when you're walking around, because it's a completed whole. It's an energy knot moving through a less dense energy medium, which we call the environment. Something like that. When I experienced this most intensely, it was almost like some kind of altered state. I mean, it made me again think of Castaneda, this time the notion of seeing, because I seemed to be able, the notions embodied in this idea were so present for me that I seemed to be able to see nature and people and situations as interference patterns of these waves. It was like a superimposition over external reality. Yeah.
Well, then, in talking about breaking this down into smaller fractals of each unit, I mean, on some points you've got it to 6 days. Would it be possible, or have you just very carefully watched and seen this reenactment of, like, say, a 4,000-year period within a time span of 6 days?
You mean like go off and rent a cabin on a lonely beach and then do the 6-day meditation of observing the passage of the history analogues from beginning to end?
It's time for supper, so you burn Rome, or I don't know.
Oh, I
Great
see.
ritual.
Well,
Ritual.
yes,
Right.
no, that's a great ritual. That sounds like a great idea. I don't exactly do it that way. I have a sense of humor about all this. I think it's unhealthy to believe in anything, especially your own ideas. I try to use it like James Joyce used it, which is as a source of humor and insight. So, for instance, when I find myself in, ordering a Caesar salad, let us say, then I meditate for a moment on Caesar and his agricultural policies, and, I always notice that Art Deco has this Egyptian vibration coming off of it. And I always know that that's because, and I see Mikhail Gorbachev as the new Justinian, and I analyze him with the politics of the Byzantine court in mind. And I see, I'm not surprised by the spread of infectious disease or the rise of fundamentalism. I think there'll be a huge economic retraction, but it won't depress me because I'm looking forward to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. In other words, it turns it all into a kind of a game. And one definition of shamanism that I've offered over the years is a shaman is someone who has seen the end. That's what it's all about. All this talk about the axis of the world tree and the well of immortality and recovering the pearl at the end of the world. All these metaphors are about seeing the end. And then, once you've seen the end, and of course you can see it at any level of resolution. Some of us just have the faintest hint of the end. And some of us, I assume, really know all about the end. I certainly don't claim to. But in any case, to whatever degree we have seen the end, we can meet life with a wry smile. Because, like the barfly said, I've seen it all, honey. So it gives you a certain kind of existential validity. Well, other people are running around worried, anxiety-driven, and which doesn't mean it is not permission to mitigate against social action, but it's permission to go into social activity with a light heart, not with the Sisyphean attitude of, well, we're going to push boulders up a hill because it's a moral imperative to do so, but it won't do any good anyway. Not at all, you know, not at all. It gives permission for great lightheartedness. I really see Joyce as the great anticipator and practitioner of this kind of art. I mean, what this is on one level is the plans of one hell of a novel. You know, a novel that stretches over 6 days, embedded in 67 years, embedded in 4,000, you know, with all these crazy characters and references and interconnected things. Because what gives allegory its power, you see, is the unconscious resonance. I mean, you tell a story about, well, the obvious story, the boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy finds girl story. It's always wonderful and fascinating because everybody's in there. You know, Ophelia and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet and Tristan and Isolde, and it's all there. It's the realization of the resonance. And I think viewing life as allegory which is usually thought of as pathological. That's alarming to them. You know, they say you're having inflationary thought processes, and but in many yoga systems, such as the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, they invite this kind of extravagant imagining. You know, they say, imagine that you are a god seated at the center of your vast estates. Into the fish ponds on your left, you will place golden koi. Into the fish pond, you know, imagine that your household utensils are of beaten silver and that you are served, and so forth and so on. This is an attempt to capture these higher level resonances and empower our lives. And what Joyce did in Ulysses was he took this very ordinary man trying to buy kidneys for his breakfast and turned him into a Greek hero, a commander of men, a general, a lover, an explorer, a warrior, a sage. When you find yourself sitting in Hadrian's hamburger joint on Sunset Boulevard, a meditation on the Emperor Hadrian and his campaigns in Britain is not at all inappropriate. I used to say Rome falls 9 times an hour because I noticed when I was vacuuming and cleaning up around the house that Rome seemed to fall in my mind at about that rate. So it's
9 times an hour?
Well, I would get back there. It's like playing the same tape over and over, you know. It's what it is. You see, I think we have become, I spoke earlier of alienation from plants, but we've become tremendously alienated from history. Yes. And we don't realize that history is who we are. And that it's rich, rich stuff. And somehow people got the notion that it's about generals and dates and popes. It is the story of who we are, where we came from. I mean, and think of the number of people who had to be on the ball to get us here today, you know. I mean, it stretches back to the last glaciation. These people were no fools. These people who crossed the ice bridges and, you know, came to terms with fire and disease. And, I mean, it's pretty astonishing. And if we can capture their morphogenetic essence, which is what I call the Tao of the ancestors, then we see ourselves no longer as this thing, the individual, this print-created atom, the voting citizen, but rather see ourselves as the wavefront of an ancestral genetic wave that stretches back into time through our parents and grandparents and all the migration. And then you see, I am not an individual. I am the temporary guardian of a certain gene stream. And, I pass it on. And that's it, just custodianship. There will be a person in the future who scratches their head the way I do. And there must have been a person in the past. It isn't me who scratches my head. It's the tendency of a certain group of genes to work together in the presence of dry scalp. So this kind of thinking takes the terror out of dissolving the individual. And to my mind, this archaic revival thing and Gaia and trying to put the brakes on the 20th century, we're going to have to create reasonable metaphors for abandoning our precious egos. Because the ego, which is the artifact, and it is an artifact, of the solar paternal linguistic style, is what's standing between us and planetary sanity. And so trying to empower the notion of the Tao with a mathematical model appealing to Western categories is a way of assuaging anxiety in people and saying, you can let down into it. I mean, I don't know what people think giving up the ego is. They say, well, then it'll just be a fascist anthill and we'll all march in lockstep and it won't matter and so forth and so on. No, that isn't it. We have that. That's what all those egocentric people living in the vast suburbs around every major city are all about. I mean, they make ego-driven decisions to consume junk food and television and political lies and live a totally regimented existence that is full of the expression of ego. So what we need is, it's the old story of the male fear of the feminine. It's a control issue. People do not want to release control, and the metaphor that we have been sold is that it's basically every man for himself. Notice the gender casting. It's every man for himself, and this absolutely precludes a sane political dialogue. Even a pessimist like Thomas Hobbes said, man to man is like unto an errant beast. But then he had the good sense to stop and say, and man to man is like unto an angel. And it's this like unto an angel part that we need a recursion to. And diminishing the ego through empowering the Tao, which means empowering the felt presence of the unconscious, which in practical terms means giving permission for ritual shamanic use of hallucinogens, is just part of the larger tendency to move back into an appreciation of the feminine, the planet, the long-term view. I mean, the present style is just to view the place as something to be trashed, and yet it's not viable.
Well, I wanted to go back to the question, under what circumstances do you agree that you are wrong?
Yes.
How do you support the theory that Gaia is old when the scientific community is arriving to the idea that, on the contrary, on a historical perspective of the planet itself, not of just humanity, the planet is at still a very early age, and they can foresee a future for three-dimensional life on Earth. that will be even a lot longer than what has been lived already.
Well, I mean, Gaia, if by Gaia we mean the living Earth, is at least 2 billion years old. So then it depends on whether you think that's old or young. The average life of a star, not many people actually know this, the average life of a star is on the order of 1 billion point 2 years. Stars come and go quite rapidly. Life on this planet is older than most stars that we see burning in the sky at night. Our star happens to lie in a certain portion of the sequence that makes it a conservative, slow-burning star. And it will burn, the current predictions are, for at least another 4 to 5 billion years. It's about halfway through its lifespan. So when the voice said to me that the Earth was old, the feeling was not so much that I was being told a fact as I was being told an attitude, that the Earth feels old. I mean, we all know, for instance, that there's continental drift, and that 270 million years ago all of the present continents were united into an enormous continent called Pangaea, and that then Pangaea broke up over hundreds of millions of years, and the continents assumed their present positions. But what most people don't know was that Pangaea was the 5th such supercontinent in the history of the Earth, and that before that there were other episodes of separation and fusion, and that had been going on for a long, long time in the history of the prebiotic Earth. So the feeling I get is that perhaps the Earth is not old, but perhaps the Earth is passing through her childbearing years, and that we're it, and that, you know, the metaphor that always suggests itself, because it is so apropos that it must be true, is that history is a gestation. History is a very temporary state of disequilibrium, of analogous to a pregnancy, where here, I mean, think of a woman before pregnancy really gets rolling, and then once it gets rolling, suddenly there's this appendage on the ordinary system, which had previously been totally complete and well-functioning entirely of itself, but suddenly this syzygy has occurred, and this other order of organism is taking shape, literally out of the tissue of the mother. And it continues to grow, and it continues to grow, and studies are done which show that if it continues to grow, everything is going to be destroyed and consumed and split apart. And then at a certain point, radical enzymes are released into the system of the mother and the infant. These phenomenal things called contractions begin to go on, which were previously not part of the system. In other words, new phenomena appear, and the child is expelled from the womb, and the mother and the child are parted, and this happens in a situation of great psychic and physiological stress and tension. There can be thrashing around and the shedding of blood and the aura of terminal medical crisis. You would never believe that you were looking at a totally ho-hum, ordinary process by which we make other people, because it looks so radical and so some sort of out of control. And yet, as soon as the child is expelled from the womb, the umbilical cord is cut, nursing begins, everything breathes a huge sigh of relief and begins to normalize itself. And I think, and now, if that process is interfered with, and the child is not allowed to leave the womb when it comes to term, then toxemia begins to set in. The shedding of toxic materials in the intrauterine environment, posing a threat to the mother and to the child. Now you've got a problem. Now you have a true medical emergency on your hand. Now you do not have an ordinary, normal birth process. Well, we're flirting with that. I would say we're past due, but it's not yet total alarm, but we are past due because we squandered our resources. We lost half of Europe in the middle of the 13th century. We have totally squandered our political and economic energy on a standing crop of nuclear weapons that depreciates so rapidly that it's just like burning money. We have not, this is not a clean, smooth, easy birth that we are looking toward, but it still looks like it's going to happen no problem sometime around the turn of the century, 2012. And then these two things, one generated by the other, but very different, will be parted, and then the Earth, I think, will return to some kind of equilibrium, and we will go off into whatever higher hidden dimension seems to pull upon us, the imagination.
Yeah, I like that image very much, the idea that the Earth is giving birth to a new entity. Now it's just an interpretation of first, what is that new entity? Does that mean all of human souls are departing, leaving the Earth barren from that kind of a consciousness? Or does that mean that a group of its souls are kind of crystallizing into forming a new being in some level, like the body of Christ?
Well,
and the Mother Earth is not going to be dying because of it. It still remains a mother who still will go through perhaps another gestation period where she can give birth to another body of Christ as creation keeps going that way.
Well, the problem with conceptualizing what this planetary transformation is like is made very clear in this theory. The problem with conceptualizing it is that we are so intellectually primitive. I mean, we are like late Roman intellectuals speculating on, the space shuttle or something like that. We cannot see far enough into the future, but we can see somewhat into the future. By the time we reach the turn of the century, I think we'll be living in a very different world. I don't mean there won't be illness, disease, warfare, and so on, but I think there will be a growing awareness on the part of many, many people that human civilization is a self-limiting exercise of some sort, and that it's preposterous to talk about industrial levels of production in the year 2500. I mean, we're going to be unrecognizable to ourselves within 50 years. We are ready to set sail into our own imaginations. That's what I think this is all about, that the cultural dimension that we are discovering is the dream time. This is what the recovery of the archaic shamanism will mean. We will go into the dream time. Perhaps we will technologically sustain it. It's a fusion of, pharmacology, cybernetics, all of these things. We want what we want, and we're going to get it one way or another. And this probably means activating the imagination. It has always been the vector opening ahead of us.
Trying not to conceptualize the time wave, but wanting to relate to it. Since I could not put it down since I've heard you talk about it about a year ago. To try to, if we look at that gentleman's question, is like, how do how can you tell? Is there some way to tell if it's right or wrong before you come to 2012 and it's just like another day in the life of the world? Is going back to the idea that the time wave may really be tracking, I mentioned it before, may just be tracking technology, maybe tracking tool making, because even our establishment economists, which are like Neanderthal type people, or Cro-Magnon or something, I don't know what era they come from, but even they have acknowledged that economics seems to be driven by technology. It's not driven by productivity, which is how much you do in an hour or something like that. It's driven by technology. And economics, my sense of economics is really the cohesion of society. It's civilization is economics. That's what economics is. And that it's also what you call economics or culture is kind of what you call anxiety. Like human anxiety or male-oriented anxiety is experienced as an attempt to harness technology to further destroy Gaia or further destroy the feminine principle of everything's all right just the way it is, leave it alone, but let's make weapons so that we can control it in our way and so forth, and the fear of the feminine and all that. Technology is utilized to protect you from the natural world, basically, or the males use technology to do that.
Right.
And these spikes and valleys and peaks and perturbations in the time wave is how technology is being used against Gaia, And however, going back to another consistent idea is that if Gaia is conscious, if the Earth is conscious, and it is taking us toward a conscious intent, if it's intentional. And if these ideas of Atlantis, but for me, it's more like an idea of Eden. Eden is not where we've been, it's where we're going. And it's embedded somehow in our stuff. That it comes again and again in every civilization, every child, every Christ born, every woman, every guy born, has this idea of Eden. And it's so the male dominant technology patriarchies use that as someplace we've been bad, we got thrown out of it, and now you're going to follow me, and I'm going to leave you back, or something. But really, it's like where Gaia is dragging us, whether we like it or not. And these spikes and valleys in the time wave is the resistance of neurotic societies against the flow of time, and against the thrust of a greater benign consciousness. And then when you something very powerful that you said when you said that somehow human beings are more human or more part of the living entity when they are managed by plants. But like another face of that is really, are human beings really just plants without roots? Who are we? It's like are we just not a more sophisticated reorganization of the plant and mineral world? And that Gaia has a plan for us, and like, what is enlightenment, for instance? Isn't an enlightened being a plant? I mean, isn't he living totally in the present? He uses now, unlike a plant, he can move around.
It's a solid state form of life,
yes.
is what you're saying.
Yeah, he's moving around, or she is moving around, and they use technology or don't use technology, but they are just living in this very moment, just like a plant does. And they accept whatever is happening just the way a plant does.
Well,
and
this is why we need to answer the question, what are these psychedelic compounds doing in these plants? It probably means they are supporting their state of mind.
Yes. Right, their moment.
That's right. That's right. Somebody said to me at one of these get-togethers that they thought animals were something plants invented to move them around. And this is, not at all, probably far off the mark.
So that's a way to take value judgments and interpretations and wishes, if wishes were horses, the biggest
right.
to take that all out of this discussion. If we look at this movement as the movement of technology, the movement of tool making, which is the manifestation of a neurotic, male-driven civilization to avoid the inevitable, which is you have to face your mother. You know, you have to face Gaia. You have to go back and say, I love you somehow, and everything's forgiven, and we're together in this.
And when you make the ultimate tool, you somehow have made, by accident almost, yourself.
Yes.
And so then
you are the
yes, you become it. You become what you behold.
So the question for me is there any high, like what human beings seem to be is like the most currently sophisticated organization of what's around. You know, that seems to be what it is. So it thinks, it's able to think and conceive in a certain way, and so on. So is there another highly sophisticated, highly conscious, seemingly mammalian, motile form that is manifesting closer to like an enlightened experience? And what comes to me then are the orcas, the whales, you know, in their special environment, which is the environment of the ocean, which is much more benign and gentle than the environment of the land. So it seems like the mammalians, the conscious mammals that went into the ocean might have reached their end point, you know, their 2012, eons ago, tens of thousands of years ago, every individual in the group beyond technology, because life, you know, when we say these people that crossed the ice bridges were not fools and so forth, well, they didn't know they weren't being fools. They were just trying
no, they were just trying to stay alive.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
And it's always that way, you know. And so, because life is not experienced as I'm going to do something for society, really. Life is experienced as I'm taking my hand out of the fire. That's how life is experienced. And technology is brought into play in civilizations by someone who wants to take their hand out of the fire. They want more money, or they want more control, or they want something. And it's very, very imperative that they have it, like Job and his computer, you know. And then that becomes so, and leads on and on and on. But here we have another group of beings that is operating in another parallel environment that my observation of them is that they're an enlightened society. And they experience life not at the level of technology, but really at the level of feeling, where life is experienced. It's only
well, perhaps we shall become plants. That would be a simple and satisfying denouement that would certainly, I mean, in some sense, I think this will happen in the sense that we will become more solid state, less emphasis on meat and muscle, and more emphasis on information and states of feeling and so forth and so on. So a vegetative, you know, where it isn't so much the opposition between male and female here, it's the opposition between plant and animal. When we talk about feminizing, we don't mean becoming more like females, we mean becoming more like plants. That's the great dichotomy of life on Earth that represents the yin and the yang, obviously. And the plants, it is a very Taoistic way to live, non-polluting. Someone here said to me that they didn't eat anything which shits. Well, that all plants come off pretty clean on that. So I think that the male, I think this male-driven, tool-building, neo-shamanic tendency to create databases of the imagination and ride through them and so forth and so on, that we will do all this. And when we're done, we will discover that the shamans in the rainforest were doing it all the time, that our computers will become more and more like their drugs. until finally we'll realize we should have used their drugs in the first place. It's just that we had this peculiar techno-mechanistic bias, but that they are doing this. Shamanism is some kind of technology for navigating in and getting information out of an invisible parallel world. I mean, I can't stress it enough. That's not a metaphor. It's a metaphor if you can't hear it. But if you've been there, you know that I mean a parallel world in the same way that Japan is a parallel world, for God's sake.
But then doing nothing with it. That's the next thing.
The shamans.
Yes, they do nothing with it.
No, they cure.
They cure.
They